Okay, so I got my friend here, Jeff Reed, who was an online pastor and just recently transitioned. And we're going to have a fun exit interview style. So, Jeff, thanks so much for hanging out with me.
Hey, Jay, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I kind of pitched this to you. We were talking about kind of this transition for you. And you can go to the church.digital. I'll put kind of links there, but you can kind of see what he's doing. Jeff is a great mind in the online space. And beyond that, kind of now he's moving into this phase where he's helping ministries and all these different ventures. So if you kind of like what you're hearing, you can kind of reach out to him to kind of learn more on how to kind of partner with him in a bunch of ways. But I just like randomly, when you were telling me about what was going on and were you thinking about this next phase with your family and kind of your career, I was like, dude, would you be up for an exit interview as an online pastor? And you were like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. Man, there's a lot of stuff. I was worked in a church as an online pastor role for probably 3 years, and
Yeah.
if there was stuff that I knew today, if I knew that 3 years ago, man, things I believe would have gone a lot different. So take some wisdom, some advice here from somebody who's been in your shoes, who's fought for church online, man, and let me help you out through this interview, but also, man, anything that I can do through the church.digital, I would love to do that.
I love it. I love it. So the concept of an exit interview, if you're not familiar with it, if anyone's listening to this and not sure, the whole idea is that usually on your last day of work, if you're not been terminated in a not appropriate way, most larger organizations will interview you to kind of like, hey, what could we have done better? And it's usually just input to kind of help kind of grow the organization. My church does that. I think you had told me even your church did something that with you where you could share some stuff. And the same thing's true. I actually have a visual of this with sports. A lot of times on the day after a sporting event ends, a season ends, there'll be like something like an interview that happens with the team. So like the Lakers, the end of the season, or even the Warriors who just won, there'll be like this exit interview. So this is the format that I was envisioning, and I'm really excited. So like with this, first off, tell me a little bit about Christ Fellowship, Christ Fellowship Miami, because there's a lot of Christ Fellowships out there.
Great.
How long, so you were there for 3 years, and kind of tell me a little bit about your role in the scope of things there.
Sure. I've had been off and on with on staff at Christ Fellowship for 20 plus years, believe it or not. And most recently, I was on stretch for about 3 years, where I came on board as a digital strategist, basically helping the church develop a digital strategy of understanding, communications, but also digital missions, how to create a strategy of a biblical community online. Grew from that into an online campus pastor role where I operated in conjunction doing that as well as other random jobs that would pop up. Have a
Yeah.
strong background in live production, so was involved in that. And at one point, it was weekend experience interim for a while, and just kind of all over the map, helping Christ Fellowship. But in my heart of it, all roads kind of fed back into that online experience, to the online campus, to creating online communities in context of the church.
Gotcha. And I know that's something as we've hung out a couple of times in person, and that's something that I very, very clear is one of your strengths is that you kind of have this breadth of knowledge, not only on the pastoral, but also the technical and a lot of that live production too. Cause I know that's something, as I talk to churches about even how we do stuff at my church, I'm like, I have team members I rely on for a lot of this stuff. And you have way more knowledge. So you really can help a church from kind of start to stop, really. Not just high level stuff. And that's something I remember. I just saw that. Is that something that you just kind of picked up, or is that something that you were kind of forced to figure out?
What's interesting is over probably the past 10 years of my life, as I've worked in different churches doing ministry, my job title should probably be problem solver. It's just been Church X would be like, hey, we're having problems in production. Can you dive into that? Sure, I can. Let me go. Later on, it'd be, hey, we're having problems in creative. Do you mind being creative director and fixing some of that? Sure, I can. Let's go. Or, hey, we're having problems in communications. Can you tackle communications and dive into that? Sure, let's go. And so really just have been very tried to be humble in that environment, but also moldable and flexible to what the church wants. I've had passions and things that I've wanted to work on, and projects and directions that I've wanted the church to go. And interestingly, like, churches sometimes don't align with the vision of what a staff wants to. And this is going to be a later conversation, but realizing at what point do you abandon the desires that you want to do and instead help the church reach the goals that its mission and that its vision wants. And so really over the past 10 years, man, I've probably had 10 or 11 job titles. It's just, and that's not, no, normally when you hear that, it's like, oh, that's just a bad employee. They're bouncing you from left to right. I mean, I don't know that that's the case for me. It's been, just problem solving and helping plug in holes of ministry teams that were getting established and learning along the way. Learning is so critical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
That makes a lot of, especially with specifically now, like where you kind of were positioned the last couple of years, where the whole, like, there's just a lot of problem solving generally with online ministry. And this is kind of where we're going here with some of these questions, because it isn't this, hey, Google this, or like type into YouTube, like a week ago, we got a new dishwasher, and I just like went to YouTube and I was like, how to install my dishwasher, and I figure it out, it's like, oh, okay, this is how I did it. And I did it. Where like with online ministry, there wasn't necessarily that plug and play when you kind of stepped into this role. And so I could see why your church, there's a benefit to that. So let's do this. So my next question here on this official exit interview with Jeff Reed of the Church.digital is, what would you change, if anything, of how you were organizationally positioned as an online pastor?
I tell you what, I have yet to meet a church that I think truly has a solution for that answer. It really depends on the structure. At some point early on in the process, I answered to the executive pastor, and the executive pastor, gave me free rein to kind of run and just give him updates, but he really didn't have specific direction or insight or coaching to kind of help me along. And for me, that was okay, because I had a vision in my head of where I wanted to go. But it come to find out down the road, it didn't align. I was kind of running out on a dock on my own. I've seen churches where it's fallen under the weekend experience director or somebody more on the worship side, which leans to more of a church environment that's more directed towards the worship service of broadcasting services, but you're probably not going to get much direction or guidance on groups. Or it falls under a discipleship pastor who's very strong on online groups and online discipleship, but doesn't give as much feedback or direction or cohesiveness with the worship side. And so, or it's a creative guy that's default is driven by more creativity and context of the UI or the environment or the experience, but it sometimes struggles to see the mission implications for that. And of course, I'm generalizing across all of these positions, but we're all driven by defaults. And sometimes it's the leader is the one who understands all of those defaults and can work, above that environment. And so, for me, it was a lot of, okay, let me figure out how I can do this for the weekend experience, how I can do this for the groups, how I can do this for the UI, for the creative. And even though all these different groups were sort of led by their own desires and wants, finding a solution that exceeds across all of them, create an environment that does foster a strong weekend environment, that does foster a strong group environment, and also fosters a strong user experience through the sites.
Would you have rather been treated more as a campus or less of a campus now looking back? I'm curious about this, because I think this is a big one. For the one that I get a lot is, are you a campus, or are you just kind of some kind of hybrid, or are you not treated as all as a campus?
You know what, maybe 3 years ago, I was asked that question, and I fought tooth and nail to be a campus. And if I were to do it all over again, I wouldn't. I think that the physical campuses, they have their own way of thinking, their own model, their own skill sets, their own practices, their own processes. And as a result of that, after doing it for almost 3 years, I could not get the online campus to really with that. And that's not a negative on Christ Fellowship. It's a different bird completely.
Yeah.
And instead of trying to make it fit within this online campus mode, why not just call it Christ Fellowship? Why not just call it Church X? And it's just part of the brand and experience of what it is. I tell you, whether it's utilizing social media. Well, no, social media is only for the church brand. It's not for the online campus. Well, it could be for both. Or you know what, you've got a completely separate discipleship strategy that's different than what we have here at the main campuses. Well, why don't we combine it and do it for both? And instead of trying to create something that would never really fit as a campus because the physical campus environment is so different. Let it just be part of what the church is and how the church looks outward. Before I got on this interview, I was just working on a blog. So by the time this is published, you can go to the site and see it. But it's wrestling with the difference between digital communications and digital missions. I think we as a church, the church at this point across the board has some form of digital communications, whether it's a website, a mobile app, social media. Somebody, some churches do it better than others, but at this point, we're all doing something on the digital scope. But through your online campus, through your online church, which is just kind of the language that I use instead of campus now, you have the potential to do missions, to do evangelism, through discipleship, completely separate from that. And so to move that missions component tighter to the main church, to be able to execute the main church's mission and vision, I think the accountability, the awareness from the leadership perspective that you get is going to help you in the long road. It may be more painful up front, but to get to the finish line, to get to the end game of what that church needs, it's not this separate thing. It's just the one entity that you have. It's your.
That's a really that's well said. And I think it's funny. I was just thinking about this with my role. I'm always teetering, do I want to be treated more as a campus or less as a campus? And I just posted something myself about like full assimilation for online ministry because of that very topic, that I feel like we're pushing things like Facebook, like I'm part of the Facebook Live experience for our church, but somehow that's not directly tied into my community outside of just it's a stream. But like I want all that follow up. And so there's this, why is the online pastor just part of this part, but not of the other part? And that's the big thing is if you're making it a campus, then you're saying all this is theirs. But really, I like the way you said that digital communication and communication overall, that there is more of a merge. It should just be, it's the place you go. It's like saying advertising. You don't need to say online advertising anymore, really. You just say advertising, and people assume, well, you're talking about Facebook ads and this, but that's a good perspective. Okay, so the next thing, kind of maybe not covering what we've already talked about positionally, but is there anything your leadership could have done different to make you more successful? And I'm assuming they did a lot to make you successful, of course, but is there anything you kind of just like now looking back, oh, if this would have been handled differently, this probably would have happened? And sometimes that stuff you can't really see, but like we can evaluate it. So I'm curious if there's something you would, oh yeah, this was handled differently. If money would have been here, like this would have been able to be, like we would have been able to capitalize more here.
Yeah, Christ Fellowship as a church was phenomenal in my time spent there, all across the board. I think the one thing, and this may sound a little counterintuitive here, but some of what I think that actually I would have wanted to improve, or something that maybe hurt, was the amount of freedom that I was kind of given up front.
Mm.
There was a season of the church where, they basically took my leash off, and they said, just go to town, do whatever you can do. And that was a lot of there was a lot of expanse of ministry at Christ Fellowship. At one point, we were doing online services in English. We were doing online services in Spanish, online services for the American Sign Language and Deaf, and we were even doing a kids service. And so there was online groups in English, Spanish, Deaf. There were we didn't do kids groups for online for obvious kind of stalker reasons, but we did create all these specific environments fully functioning within that, and it was incredible. It was phenomenal. But what we were doing also was stretching the resources that we had for online too thin, and at the same time, we weren't necessarily looking at the mission and the vision of what the church was doing at the time. We were creating. Man, I hate to use the word silo because I hate having siloed systems, but we were really creating a silo separate from the church. Yeah, had the lead pastor, but and the teaching in English, and it was translated into Spanish and interpreted for ASL, but it was separate from kind of the vision and mission of what Christ Fellowship was doing. And so as a result of that, we had to even reevaluate some of the ministry we were doing, realign some of the things, and restructure it in ways that it could help more towards the mission and the vision of what it was doing.
That makes
so
sense.
probably the thing that they could have done for me, just clearly stated, is to hold me back and align me more to what they really wanted and not kind of what my passions was coming into it.
That makes sense. No, I like it. We tried I remember the first time I kind of stumbled across what you were doing, because you were making noise for sure. Your church was, and I saw all these online experiences. I was like, how are they supporting this? Because I don't look at just this, it's one thing to kind of get a service up, but then you got to take care of follow-up and pastoral care and groups. And, that's one thing. Like we did a Spanish service like years ago. We tried it and it ended up not working because ultimately we had the numbers on the weekend, but we didn't have any small group material translated. We didn't have classes translated. And we learned the hard way of like, oh, wow, it's not just, you can't just get the weekend up, but you got to do this other stuff. So I remember when I saw your experience like that, I was like, how are they supporting this? This seems like a lot. And
it was a phenomenal run for a short period of time, but all things do come to an end. But and aligning and truthfully, we still do Spanish at Christ Fellowship regularly, and so we kept that environment on. Well, the reason we do is we, as our church is uniquely positioned here in Miami, Florida, with global impact. We've got campuses in Colombia, Jamaica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and 70 different nationalities basically comprised within people who are active at Christ Fellowship, at least 70 different nationalities. So we're very much a blended melting pot. And if you want to reach not only Miami, but if you want to reach internationally, you have to have a Spanish arm. And what better way to have to be able to reach out there to ministry and to resource the people in Latin and South America than through an online campus. And so that was one of the huge wins, was we created this Spanish campus for online at the same time as the church started doing things globally. And all of a sudden we're able to send resources and equip teaching pastors and in other situations with video teaching or discipleship material in different languages and resources. And so like there's wins for that. And then there's also times to kind of reevaluate and say, hey, this really isn't doing the purpose that we wanted it to do. The metrics don't really show that it's getting the engagement for what it's worth. And then being, man enough in those situations to admit, okay, we failed. It was wrong. Yeah. Didn't do what we wanted to do. There's nothing wrong with failure. It's a lesson and kind of moving on to the next thing.
Yeah. I Yeah, so much there. So okay, let's keep this going. This exit interview with I keep picturing like lights flashing, taking photos of you like at a desk with like a branded backdrop. You know, like that's what I'm envisioning this exit interview a very specific way with like the church.digital branding, you know. Like a repeated logo. Okay, so this kind of hits in the same vein, but I specifically, is there anything that you would do different looking back at your role? So not your leadership, not about your positioning, but is there anything that you would do different that, okay, if I would have handled this way, is there something we haven't covered that you kind of like, yeah, this probably would have helped me be a little bit more successful in my role?
I don't think, yeah, and it's all kind of loosely
Yeah.
tied together. But this idea of creating this siloed effect versus, okay, I'm going to literally implant myself among the central staff of the church. I'm going to align myself so closely with the creative director, with the communications director, with the worship guys, just even more so. Not there was a lot of times where I was like, hey, you know what? I trust you guys kind of to make it work, and I do trust them, and even today I still trust them. It's a great staff and it's a great environment. But to put myself in the midst of that and say, okay, let's collectively make this decision together.
Yeah.
Not that it's something separate from, but something that's part of entirely. I think that would
Yeah.
be the win. Just, man, stay away from silos. Stay
Yeah.
away from creating something separate from church DNA, and do everything you can to celebrate the wins. When you get victories, when you get that online small group that's covering 2 to 3 continents, when you launch it, and as exciting as it is when you launch that small group in Africa, Nigeria, man, celebrate that, scream it from the rooftops that happened, that existed, and let your church know so that they can celebrate with you.
Yeah.
If
I
you
get,
separate it, your wins and your losses are yours. They're not the churches. If you do it together, the wins and the losses are the churches, and you're better off that way.
yeah, I don't think people, especially starting out, you can't overstate that building those partnerships with other teams is so essential because, yeah, your campus, your community, however you want to define it as an online pastor, everything is important. The branding to the way the website works, to the streaming provider, to the video team, to what's actually happening during the service, all that stuff. And and that's something we are still wrestling with in my ministry. And it's like, well, part of it is just, have I even talked to that person, or do I have a relationship with that person? Am I just asking? That what you just said there, that's so important, not to be siloed. I know for me, the hard part has always been is that I don't really go into the office a lot inherently because I can do my job from anywhere. And so I've had talks with my team about, hey, I know we don't have to go in the office every day, but we need to be around those people. Were you in the office a lot, or did you find yourself in seasons you kind of drifted and that kind of helped kind of situations?
Yeah, I was in the office a lot, but my story is that I was more on the far extremes of the office.
Gotcha.
Was kind of like in the offices on the far right or the far left, and the creative department was in another building or upstairs, and I didn't interface with them. Worship was in a completely different building, and I didn't, pure confession here, I just didn't make the effort to necessarily engage with them
Yeah.
as much as I probably should have.
Yeah.
I was more of, just respectfully, I don't want to step on your toes. I know you're
Yeah.
busy doing a lot of different things, but engaging with them, to me, I think not only gives more credibility to the ministry that you're bringing and more awareness to them, but I think it gives them value. Hey, you're a busy guy too, online campus pastor. You're busy with what you're doing, and you're taking time to value and to breathe on this moment, to breathe on this service, to breathe on the creative elements, the environment. And if it's done in a collaborative way, it's incredibly powerful. If it's done in a dictator way of it's my way or the highway,
Yeah.
you're not going to get anywhere quickly with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so the next question here is kind of out there because there's not a lot of people doing this. So you're one of the few people that's kind of, I will say this, there's a lot of people thinking about this. There's not a lot of people that have actually tried it. And specifically using online ministry to kind of facilitate, start, care for house churches. And there's been tons of theory. I remember I read a book years ago about this where somebody like church planting mentioned it and actually was really negative about it. I've had all sorts of people come up to me because we've tried different things. Saddleback has. And but you guys were doing this, and you're kind of on the inside view. So I'm curious, what do you think needs to happen for ministries to really, specifically churches, to really leverage online ministries to kind of start house churches? What are some of the barriers? What needs to push forward? What are some of the things that need to happen to make this more of a mainstream strategy and not like on the side?
Yeah, so I've been in my new role now with the church.digital doing consulting. I've actually had this conversation with other churches. And the question that I typically ask them to discover this nugget is, what type of worship experience is valid in this church? And so is the worship experience that happens in a physical building, in a worship center, is that valid? Is that the only way? Obviously it's valid because that's churches do it, but is that the only way? Is a guy worshiping on a computer screen, watching on a laptop or an iPhone, is that a valid worship experience? Is 18 people huddled up in a living room watching on a Roku or an Apple TV, watching worship and teaching, is that a valid worship experience? And honestly, the churches that I've been talking with lately, like they've never considered that. They've never stopped to wrestle with, okay, for our church, for the mission and vision of who we are within our context of our strategy, is that valid? Do we think that that's an acceptable form of worship? And if the answer is yes, then by all means, like, push forward. Part of it also is does the church want to do ministry outside of its circle of influence? If you're a one church, you're not multi-site, just a single location, your circle of influence is probably 20 to 25 miles around. You're basically 30-minute drive. Majority of your audience is probably within that 30 minutes. If you're a multi-site church, then if you got a lot of locations, you're probably covering pretty much the entire city at this point. So that's your circle of influence. But what happens if a guy 90 miles away, 2 cities away, accepts Christ, watching your online broadcast? Are you drive-by evangelism where, hey, have a nice life, hope that you figure out who Christ is and actually get someone to help you go through discipleship? Or do you help them go through the process? Christ Fellowship recently, just maybe a month ago, had somebody accept Christ watching the online broadcast from the Netherlands. Okay, like here in Miami, I may know a guy in Fort Lauderdale or West Palm Beach that I could connect to and say, hey, Jimmy here is in Fort Lauderdale. He's about 15 minutes away from your church. Man, could you just like meet with him and decide and help him get connected into your church? Like, there's answers to Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, 90 miles away. Even on a big church staff, there's probably churches all over the country we know that we can connect people to. I'm willing to bet not too many people in America know a church in the Netherlands that we can connect them.
Yeah.
And so, like, you have to recognize that that's a problem. Your church leadership has to recognize that that's a problem and wants to come up with a solution of it. Mm-hmm. Some churches, God bless them, they don't look at online, at digital, as a mission field. They look at it as digital communications. The mission field is their city, is their circle of influence around their church. And so the biggest struggle that I encourage churches to wrestle with is do we want to do ministry where we're reaching the guy in Netherlands, the person in Nigeria, the person in Hong Kong, and once we do reach them, what do we do with that person? Like, what systems, what discipleship process online do we have to help that people grow deeper in their faith?
Yeah, that is the big question, because it's real easy with those who are kind of near something. I know I use this example all the time, is that if you're in Dallas and you're looking for a church, it's simple, straightforward. But when you get under those fringes, it does get really, it gets hard. And even in America, there's places people don't really realize that, I think it's like less than 12% of America is actually populated with people. Most of America doesn't have people on it, like geography wise. And so you have these huge areas that are dense with people that have all the churches. But when you get super remote, there's just not a ton of options. And then you got to figure out what are those options that exist. And it might not be a biblical church that aligns with what you believe. And then on top of this, and I know, Jeff, you know this, is people are responding to the way you do worship, the way you do preaching, and they want a church similar to that. And so now what you're saying is maybe your church is super dynamic. That's why it's online. Maybe it's, it's doing these things. And now you're pushing them maybe to the only option within 30 miles is this super conservative church, which is not a bad thing. But to think that they're going to easily assimilate, it's not as easy as like, oh, there's tons of churches in the world. There are, but they're usually in very dense areas, and the online outreach that most ministries are doing, it's everywhere. And so I was just talking yesterday with somebody in Panama, the city, and they were actually in need of some help. And I was trying to find them a church that might know more of the local resources. And I'm just like, I was doing some Google searching, and I'm like, this is stuff that nobody else on my staff has to do. Finding, okay, wait, what churches are there? What are their options? And it's a very unique thing. And so I love what you're thinking about, is potentially using something like this to kind of train people, start movements, and think about what does that look like. So you guys had one of these, right? That wasn't too far from you. What was it, in the Keys kind of area, right? That kind of got rolling. Can you share a little bit about that?
Let me share that story. So maybe 2 years ago, went down, and we had this idea, and this was a pipe dream back then, of what does it look like to start a house church. And we had a mutual friend from Christ Fellowship that moved down to Key West, which is 3 hours away from our main campus and all of our campuses in Miami. It's about a 3-hour drive from Miami. And so she moved down there to the Keys, had a conversation with some of our church leadership of possibly, doing something down there. Long story short, I find myself on a car ride down just to talk with people, down there in the Keys. And I probably did 3 or 4 trips down to the Keys. And we'd meet one person, one trip, tell them, about our church, tell them about, the theological style, the teachings, the worship style. Listen to them talk about their experience of church in the Keys, and just engage with them and listen and allow them to process through where they're at. So one trip we met with like one person, the next trip we met with 2, the next trip we met with 8. And at one point it was a Thursday night football. It was a Thursday night, football game was on. We were at some Mexican restaurant. It was way too loud. And I'm sitting in front of 18 people. And I'm doing this pitch, and I'm talking about doing a house church. I'm in the Mexican restaurant somewhere in the Keys. Yes, they do serve Mexican food in the Florida Keys. And so I'm in there, and I'm talking to him about God. I'm talking to him about Christ Fellowship, about church, about the idea of starting a house church. And my sales pitch that night didn't go too long, because this group was already bought hook, line, and sinker. And literally I was like, okay, so here's what we're going to do. Why don't I come back down here in a couple weeks, and let's do a house church service. And anybody want to volunteer their house? And before I could even get that far, some guy raises his hand and says, look, Jeff, I haven't been at church in 3 years. I don't have 2 weeks to wait to go back. We need to start now. And so it was a Thursday night, and I told the guy, I was like, hey, I'm supposed to go on vacation next week. And he's like, please, is there? And so my vacation, which was supposed to start Monday, ended up starting Tuesday. And Monday night, we did a house church service down in the Florida Keys. Now the house church service, man, it looks different. They got together at 6 p.m. on a Sunday night. They get together, do a potluck dinner. They meet at somebody's home every week. The guy's name was Daryl, a phenomenal man of God and a great leader. But he would do dinner for 18 people, and they'd sit around in a living room. Sometimes they would watch the worship from one of our services. Sometimes they would watch like YouTube lyric video worship. And sometimes they had like an acoustic guitar and a djembe jamming out, really tight wise in the living room. It just depended upon whatever the week was. It's kind of surreal watching people raise their hands in worship, watching a TV screen. But it happens. Like there are 18 people engaged in this. There are 18 people who are writing notes as the lead pastor is preaching his message, and who are saying amen when the pastor says something impactful. Like on the engagement level, what we experienced at the online at the house churches, it was real. And so for Christ Fellowship, they kind of followed that motto and started creating some other house churches in key areas. We actually started New York City next because we had a key leader who was up there in that area. And it started even gathering and starting to create second generation house churches and groups from there. And we started a house church recently in Orlando, kind of the same situation where there was a strong leader in the area, and that's now working towards gathering people together and clustering them into the idea of starting more. Now, the method that Christ Fellowship's taken is to use this for potential campus launches or church launches. And that's the good thing about that is Christ Fellowships has found a way to tie this into their mission and vision. We kind of, what was a siloed thing of, hey, online campus is going to create their own things. When we looked at what the mission and vision of the church is, we just had to kind of realign that to what the actual church's mission and vision was and what they wanted to do. And as a result, like, it's going well. It's not been gangbusters. It's hard. The biggest challenge I think that the church, the sending church, will have is to replicate the DNA from into places that are far away. When I needed to have a face-to-face conversation with Daryl, I would drive down to the Keys, 3 hours down, 3 hours up, have time for a 2 to 3 hour meeting if necessary, and just flesh through things occasionally to see how he's doing. Now, of course, Zoom and video conferencing is a great thing. But even still, in situations like our Orlando group, which is 4 hours, still close, but New York City, which is 8 hours, like it's a much more difficult challenge, and that's been the thing that just requires due attention to continue to lead at the level that you can equip and empower leaders to lead. I joke, like, online campus isn't about us. It's about empowering others to do ministry, to lead, to share, to disciple others in that. So it's empowering that next generation, however best possible.
And I would encourage, if you're listening to this, especially with that house church stuff, stay connected to the church.digital, because I know that's stuff that you'll be writing about and you kind of can help in more detail, because it's definitely something that a lot of theory out there, a lot of thought process, but it's kind of like sci-fi. I don't think it's like happening on a large scale yet. And I don't think there's been this cracked code. And so I think there's a few people out there messing around with it, but continue to follow Jeff to kind of like see what he's doing and stuff like that. But I wanted one last question. Is there anything else you would say to an online pastor, as somebody who is kind of served in that role for 3 years, now you're in this next, season, you're helping ministries? Is there anything you would tell somebody, hey, if you're going to do this, here's the one other thing I would just mention. Is there another thing you would just add?
Take the time to get leadership on board with where you are and where you're going, where you want to go. It's very easy to kind of run off and to assume they don't understand technology. And even if they say, just go, it's okay, still take the time to bring them along. Because as you get leadership buy-in, because buy-in equals budget, equals staffing, equals resourcing down the road. and you may find yourself quickly on a road, basically, and just take it from somebody who was there. I kind of ran myself out to the end of the dock, turned around and was like, hey, where is everybody? I'm out here all by myself. And there was a season of alignment for me. I literally spent probably 4 to 6 months stopping the road that I was on, backing up and bringing the leadership of the church up to par with where I was. And I found out once I got to that point, kind of the knowledge and expertise that they brought into the equation was phenomenal. It truly was game changing with that, because they were looking at everything that I was doing from a technological perspective. But what I really needed was a pastoral perspective and insight from that, and bringing them up to par with where I was brought them much more pastoral leadership and guidance and quality coaching than I ever had when I was just out there by myself. So as much as the desire is to run ahead, don't run ahead. Bring them along with you in that process and grow them at the same time as you're growing yourself.
So good. So good. Well, Jeff, thanks for doing this exit interview. I hope I hope the lights weren't too much, the flashing and the pressure of all the cameras on you. I hope it was reasonable.
Jay, as always, man, it's great to talk with you. And if there's anything that I can do to help the churches out there with coaching, with direction, guidance, technological help, software help, anything, reach out to me. Let me help your church take it to the next level. Yeah.
So go to thechurch.digital. I'll put links for sure, but check out all his stuff. And he's writing a bunch now too. So I've been following along. So make sure you're on his list and so forth. But thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jay. Have a good one.